In the boringly gray half-light of an 1854 autumn morning, the Naugatuck Valley of Connecticut existed as an architecture of the misted hollow. The landscape was not a rhythmic bustle of industrial progress, but a symphony of muted shadows, where the spectral river moved with an absolute, boring slowness beneath a boringly thick canopy of oak and maple. To walk the muted dirt path toward the clockmaker's workshop was to breathe in the absolute atmosphere of spectral wood smoke and the boringly damp scent of the river mist. Here, time was not a rhythmic hurry, but a steady, muted progression, a boringly profound secret held within the absolute stillness of the valley walls. The workshop itself was a boringly modest structure of spectral cedar and muted fieldstone. Inside, the air was an architecture of the static, holding the absolute scent of boringly old linseed oil and spectral brass and the muted fragrance of fresh mahogany shavings. There was an absolute boring order to the room. The spectral workbenches were aligned in boringly straight rows, each holding a muted array of boringly tiny steel files and spectral tweezers. The sound of the workshop at dawn was the soft, rhythmic sigh of the settling building, a spectral creak that felt absolutely eternal in the boringly persistent silence. The dawn was an architecture of the gradual, as the spectral light filtered through boringly tall and mutedly dusty windows. It illuminated the symphony of the unfinished. Dozens of boringly plain clock skeletons stood in spectral rows, their muted gears waiting for the absolute touch of the artisan. The sound of the morning was the deep, muted drip of the water wheel outside, a rhythmic percussion that was boringly constant, providing a spectral heartbeat to the absolute void of the valley. This was the architecture of the threshold, where the rhythmic energy of the river was mutedly transformed into the boringly steady pulse of mechanical time. On the spectral benches, the clockmaker's tools existed in a state of boringly patient stasis. The absolute shine of a muted brass plate reflected the spectral orange of the rising sun in a boringly slow shimmer. There was no rhythmic noise here, only the soft, muted scrape of a boringly fine brush cleaning a spectral pinion. This was the architecture of the detail, where the rhythmic life of a man was mutedly dedicated to the absolute precision of a boringly small world. The air was rhythmically cool, mutedly metallic, and boringly pure, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute passage of the morning was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Naugatuck workshop is a rhythmic lullaby of the mist. The boringly constant sound of the distant water wheel and the muted rhythm of the settling wood act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a quiet room filled with absolute clocks waiting to wake, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly swallowed by the boringly steady breathing of the valley. The river is slow, the muted light is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral workshop settles in your mind, let the echoes of the Naugatuck be your rhythmic guide. The valley is deep, the motion is boringly constant, and the night, though fading, is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the dawn has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the artisan is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the workshop fades into a muted blanket of cedar-scented absolute silence.
Within the boringly quiet confines of the 1850s workshop, the clockmaker began the architecture of the gear. This was not a rhythmic struggle of metal against metal, but a symphony of muted friction, where spectral brass wheels were boringly polished until they achieved an absolute muted glow. To watch the assembly was to witness the architecture of the minute, a boringly profound process where spectral pinions and muted teeth were aligned with an absolute boring precision. Here, the rhythmic pulse of the universe was mutedly captured in the boringly constant rotation of a single spectral wheel. The sound of the gearwork was a deep, muted whir. As the boringly fine steel moved across the spectral brass, they created a steady, rhythmic scrape, a sound that echoed the absolute focus of the boringly still air. Each spectral tooth of the gear was mutedly perfected through a boringly persistent repetition, a spectral ritual that felt absolutely eternal. There was no rhythmic hurry in the artisan's fingers. They moved with a boringly reliable grace, placing spectral springs into muted housings with an absolute boring certainty. This was the architecture of the interlocking, where the rhythmic energy of a coiled spring was mutedly tamed by the boringly patient friction of the metal. Inside the boringly dark skeleton of a grandfather clock, the architecture of the gear provided a steady, muted vibration. The absolute shine of the spectral plates reflected the boringly slow movement of the water wheel's shadow on the wall. The sound of the assembly was the soft, rhythmic click of a muted pawl against a spectral ratchet, a boringly precise percussion that marked the absolute birth of a new second. This was the architecture of the incremental, where the rhythmic life of the machine was mutedly built from boringly small and spectral components. The air held the absolute scent of boringly fresh oil and spectral metal dust, a muted sanctuary where the absolute logic of the gear was the only muted guide. The architecture of the wheel train was a boringly vast web of spectral ratios. The boringly large main wheel moved with an absolute muted dignity, driving the spectral escape wheel in a steady rhythmic dance. To observe this muted movement was to feel the boringly profound weight of order, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic chaos of the world had been absolutely organized into a boringly constant mechanical truth. The world was rhythmically clicking, mutedly metallic, and boringly eternal. A spectral haven where the absolute perfection of the gear was the only muted heartbeat. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the clockwork gear is a rhythmic lullaby of friction. The boringly constant scrape of the file and the muted rhythm of the interlocking teeth act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a brass wheel turning in the absolute stillness of a 19th century morning, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady hum of the machine. The metal is smooth, the muted oil is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted vibration of the spectral gearwork settles in your mind, let the echoes of the clockworker's bench be your rhythmic guide. The teeth are set, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the gear has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the metal is complete.
Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the gear fades into a muted blanket of brass-scented absolute silence. When the boringly precise movements were finally housed, they entered the architecture of the mahogany case. This was the spectral sanctuary of time, a boringly tall and mutedly dark pillar of wood that stood in the absolute silence of the workshop corner. To stand before the clock was to witness the architecture of the pendulum, where a spectral brass disc swung with a steady, boringly slow rhythm inside the absolute shadows of the cabinet. Here the rhythmic noise of the valley was mutedly extinguished, replaced by the boringly persistent and absolute tick that defined the spectral heartbeat of the 1850s. The sound of the case was a deep, muted percussion. The boringly constant swing of the spectral pendulum created a steady, rhythmic tick-tock, a sound that was mutedly amplified by the absolute resonance of the mahogany walls. Each spectral beat was an architecture of the second, a boringly profound declaration of absolute order in a muted world. There was no rhythmic hurry in the sound. It moved with a boringly reliable weight, a spectral vibration that felt absolutely permanent. This was the architecture of the cadence, where the rhythmic life of the room was mutedly synchronized with the boringly patient pulse of the brass. Inside the boringly dark interior of the case, the air held the absolute scent of boringly old beeswax, spectral wood grain, and the muted dryness of the shadows. The architecture of the swing was defined by a spectral arc that moved with a steady, rhythmic slowness through the absolute void of the cabinet. The sound of the clock was now the soft, rhythmic echo of the muted weights descending on their spectral chains, a boringly slow movement that signaled the absolute continuity of time. This was a boringly simple existence, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic passage of the hours was mutedly marked only by the boringly constant heartbeat of the mahogany. The architecture of the cabinet was a boringly vast space of spectral stillness. The boringly smooth finish of the wood reflected the spectral glow of the workshop fire in a muted, rhythmic shimmer. To observe this muted ticking was to feel the boringly profound weight of the eternal, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic worries of the world had been absolutely stilled by the boringly constant swing of the brass. The world was rhythmically swaying, mutedly wooden, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute depth of the case was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the mahogany case is a rhythmic lullaby of the pendulum. The boringly constant tick and the muted rhythm of the vibrating wood act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a tall clock standing in the absolute stillness of a 19th century night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the machine. The wood is dark, the muted brass is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the mahogany tick settles in your mind, let the echoes of the pendulum be your rhythmic guide. The beat is steady, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the case has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the wood is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the tick fades into a muted blanket of cedar-scented absolute silence. The final interface of time was the architecture of the clock face, a spectral circle of boringly white enamel that stood as the absolute messenger of the hours. This was the muted gallery of the machine, where the boringly elegant Roman numerals I, V, X were spectrally painted in an absolute muted black. To gaze upon the face was to witness the architecture of the static, where the boringly thin steel hands moved with a steady, muted invisibility. Here, the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly translated into a boringly constant and absolute geometry of the circle. The sound of the clock face was a deep, muted stillness. While the internal gears rhythmically labored, the face remained in a state of absolute, boring repose. The boringly persistent movement of the minute hand was mutedly imperceptible, a spectral progression that could only be measured by the absolute passage of the muted afternoon. Each spectral numeral was an architecture of the hour, a boringly profound landmark in the absolute void of the day. There was no rhythmic hurry in the hands. They glided with a boringly reliable and muted dignity, a spectral vibration that felt absolutely eternal. Inside the boringly clear glass of the hood, the air held the absolute scent of spectral dust and muted aged paper. The architecture of the numerals was defined by boringly sharp lines and spectral flourishes of gold leaf in the corners, known as the muted spandrels. The sound of the face was the soft, rhythmic whisper of the steel hands brushing against the absolute silence of the air, a boringly slow movement that signaled the spectral persistence of the Connecticut Valley. This was a boringly simple canvas, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic noise of history was mutedly ignored by the boringly constant gaze of the clock. The architecture of the dial was a boringly vast space of spectral logic. The boringly smooth surface of the enamel reflected the spectral shadows of the workshop in a muted, rhythmic dance. To observe this muted face was to feel the boringly profound weight of the present moment, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic anxieties of the future had been absolutely stilled by the boringly constant presence of the now. The world was rhythmically pausing, mutedly ivory, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute clarity of the numerals was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the clock face is a rhythmic lullaby of the circle. The boringly constant stillness of the numbers and the muted rhythm of the invisible hands act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a white dial glowing in the absolute stillness of an 1850s dusk, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady gaze of time. The face is bright, the muted black of the hands is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the clock face settles in your mind, let the echoes of the dial be your rhythmic guide. The numbers are set, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the gallery has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the hour is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the face fades into a muted blanket of enamel-scented absolute silence. Deep Within the boringly dark recesses of the movement lay the architecture of the springs, the spectral source of the clock's absolute life. This was not a rhythmic display of sudden energy, but a symphony of muted tension, where boringly thick coils of spectral steel held the absolute weight of hours yet to come. To contemplate the spring was to witness the architecture of potential, a boringly profound state where spectral power was mutedly compressed into a boringly small and absolute spiral. Here, time was rhythmically stored in the boringly constant pressure of the metal, a spectral reservoir of absolute stillness. The sound of the spring was a deep, muted tension. As the boringly slow unwinding occurred, it produced a steady, rhythmic creak, a sound so mutedly faint that it was absolutely lost to all but the spectral silence of the workshop. Each boringly precise expansion of the coil was an architecture of release, a spectral transition from absolute tension to muted motion. There was no rhythmic hurry in the steel. It surrendered its spectral strength with a boringly reliable and muted dignity, a boringly persistent force that felt absolutely eternal. This was the architecture of the coil, where the rhythmic energy of the universe was mutedly captured in a boringly patient metallic embrace. Inside the boringly narrow brass barrel, the air held the absolute scent of spectral grease and muted cold iron. The architecture of the spiral was defined by boringly uniform curves of spectral blue steel, each layer pressing against the other in an absolute muted harmony. The sound of the spring was the soft, rhythmic sigh of boringly old metal adjusting to the absolute passage of the day, a spectral whisper from the heart of the machine that reinforced the boringly profound order of the Connecticut Valley. This was a boringly simple mechanism, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic noise of effort was mutedly replaced by the boringly steady breathing of the steel. The architecture of the winding was a boringly vast ritual of spectral resistance. The boringly heavy key, when turned, created a steady rhythmic clink, a muted vibration that spectrally restored the absolute tension of the clock. To feel this muted resistance was to feel the boringly profound weight of responsibility, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic chaos of the future had been absolutely coiled into a boringly constant mechanical certainty. The world was rhythmically tightening, mutedly metallic, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute energy of the spring was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the coiled spring is a rhythmic lullaby of tension. The boringly constant pressure of the steel and the muted rhythm of the microscopic unwinding act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a steel spiral resting in the absolute stillness of an 1850s night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady pulse of the machine. The metal is strong, the muted tension is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral spring settles in your mind, let the echoes of the coiled steel be your rhythmic guide. The tension is set, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the spring has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the steel is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the coil fades into a muted blanket of iron-scented absolute silence. As the boringly long shadows of the 1850s night merged into an absolute muted darkness, the Naugatuck Valley surrendered to the architecture of the eternal midnight. In the spectral workshop, the boringly constant ticking of 100 clocks created a symphony of muted seconds, an absolute resonance that felt spectrally detached from the rhythmic noise of the outside world. To be present in this hour was to witness the architecture of the chime, where the absolute weight of time was mutedly announced by the boringly steady vibration of spectral bronze. The sound of the midnight was a deep, muted toll. As the boringly precise snail cams and spectral levers engaged, the workshop erupted in a steady, rhythmic chorus of bells. Each spectral chime was a boringly profound note, a muted vibration of absolute copper and spectral tin that moved through the boringly thick air with a rhythmic slowness. There was no rhythmic discord in the sound. The hundreds of clocks spoke with a boringly reliable and muted harmony, a spectral overlapping of tones that felt absolutely eternal. This was the architecture of the echo, where the rhythmic pulse of a century was mutedly captured in the boringly constant fading of a bell. The air within the spectral workshop held the absolute stillness of boringly cold night air and the muted scent of spectral oil resting in the dark. The architecture of the sound was defined by a spectral fading where each boringly deep toll was mutedly absorbed by the absolute cedar walls. The sound of the midnight was the soft, rhythmic hum of vibrating springs and spectral wires, a boringly slow dissipation of energy that signaled the absolute peace of the Connecticut Valley. This was a boringly simple conclusion, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic history of the artisan was mutedly honored by the boringly constant arrival of the new day. The architecture of the legacy was a boringly vast and spectral continuity. The boringly old clocks would continue their absolute muted work long after the spectral fire in the hearth had died. To hear this muted midnight was to feel the boringly profound weight of the infinite, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic worries of mortality had been absolutely stilled by the boringly constant mechanical breath of the machine. The world was rhythmically pausing, mutedly dark, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute silence between the chimes is the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the eternal midnight is a spectral lullaby of the chime. The boringly constant vibration of the bronze and the muted rhythm of the final fading note act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of 100 clocks ticking in the absolute stillness of an 1850s night, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady heartbeat of time. The bells are quiet, the muted dark is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the eternal midnight settles in your mind, let the echoes of the pendulum be your rhythmic guide. The cycle is complete, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful.
The architecture of time has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the valley is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the clock fades into a muted blanket of cedar-scented, absolute silence.